Welcome everyone to CA 151, Sanitation and Product ID. We are going to get started here with Chapter 1, which is on keeping food safe. It's our introduction to sanitation and how important sanitation is to everything that we do in the professional kitchen. As part of this chapter, we're going to talk about what is foodborne illness and how we can determine if it's occurred. We're going to talk about challenges to food safety, the costs, monetary and otherwise, of a foodborne illness. We're going to talk about contaminants that can make food unsafe, how food becomes unsafe, food that's most likely to be unsafe, people that are at high risk for foodborne illness, and food safety responsibilities of the person in charge of the restaurant or the food service operation. If not now, down the road, that will probably be you. So what is foodborne illness? Foodborne illness is defined as a disease that's transmitted to people through food. When we think of food, we think of flavor and texture and color and profile, and we think about how good food is. But we have to remember, at the base of everything, the food that we serve to our customer has to be safe. If it makes people sick, it does not matter how good it looks, how good it tastes, or anything like that. Our primary focus at the core is serving safe food to our customer. And when it does not happen, then we run into foodborne illness. What makes it more interesting is if we end up with an outbreak. So definition of a foodborne outbreak is when 2 or more people have the same symptoms after eating the same food. With that, typically an investigation is either conducted by the state or local regulatory authorities like your health department. And then to pull it all together, it's confirmed by laboratory analysis as far as if it's considered an outbreak. Foodborne illness is something definitely that is scary to those of us that do this professionally. But if it's looking as an outbreak, it's even considered worse that way. So we want to make sure that we are doing things that prevent people from getting sick. Now, there are some challenges that we have to take in consideration. First and foremost is time. We're under tremendous pressure to work as efficiently, as quickly as possible. And sometimes we feel that, we just need to cut that corner because it takes too much time. Sometimes cutting those corners can lead to somebody getting sick. Language and culture barriers. Sometimes you have staff that speaks a different language than you. That can create communication barriers. Cultural differences can influence how staff views food safety as well. The United States has some of the most strictest food safety code around the world. I know if you've ever traveled outside the United States and you've seen what it looks like in the markets and things like that, you might be going, whoa, that's definitely not what you're going to see here in Peoria or elsewhere in the United States. So with language barriers and cultural differences, that can sometimes be a challenge to what we are doing in our kitchens to make sure we're providing safe food. Literacy and education is another area as well. Sometimes we find staff that has varying education levels. So it can make it difficult for us as the chefs, the person in charge, to communicate and educate our staff as far as food safety. Pathogens are another thing. It's interesting, what we once considered safe now are considered, TCS foods, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So these pathogens that we thought, were not going to affect certain types of food, all of a sudden we're now finding, oh no, now these pathogens actually are. Either there's been a mutation or they have In the past, it's just been very, very low occurrence, or we've attributed it to something else. Another challenge can be unapproved suppliers. You got to remember that food that's coming in our door needs to be coming from places that are considered approved suppliers. It can be really, really problematic. It's great, for example, that your cousin goes and they shoot a deer and they want you to buy the deer and then serve it at your restaurant. Well, that might be cool because you're getting a good price point or something like that, or working a deal for you. But, that's not an approved source. And that is a potential higher risk for making your customers sick because it's not coming from those approved suppliers. Another challenge can be if you work with high risk populations. We'll talk about that in a bit, who are considered high risk customers. But if you are working with high risk customers, then of course your probability of people getting sick is higher, which means you even have to be at a higher level of your conscientiousness within what you're doing in your kitchen to prevent those guests from getting sick. And of course, what we find, all the time in our industry for many reasons, but staff turnover. Try to train new staff, making sure they understand the concepts, making sure they understand the standard operating procedures, what the expectations are when it comes to food safety training is frustrating, to say the least. It is kind of nice in respect that the state of Illinois does require anybody that is working with food to have a food handler's license, at least a basic license. But even with that, there are still things that can sometimes slip through the cracks. What does foodborne illness cost us as a business? First and foremost, the loss of customer and sales. If your place is known to cause foodborne illnesses, you're probably not going to get a lot of customers coming in the doors because they're not going to play Russian roulette with their health. Obviously, if you don't have as many customers, you're losing out on your sales. Of course, the reputation, not only for the restaurant, but also for the chef. Remember, everyone, when you are running a restaurant, you're in charge of the restaurant, your name is attached to that restaurant. If somebody gets sick because of a foodborne illness, even if it's because it was one of your staff that did it, you didn't do it directly, but you're in charge of that kitchen, which means it's attached to you, which can hurt your reputation personally as a culinarian. And of course, it's going to hurt the reputation of the business itself, which again goes back to that first one as far as loss of customers. Negative media exposure. People say there's no such thing as bad publicity or bad exposure. I don't always agree with that 100%. If it's coming out in the Peoria Journal-Star that your restaurant made 10 people have to go to the hospital because of a Shigella outbreak, I don't think that media exposure is going to get you more people coming in your door. So, that can definitely make a difference. Of course, lower staff morale. If you're not having more customers coming in because there's an issue, guess what? Those front of the house people are not making money. Those kitchen staff are going to be losing hours. It's not going to be good for the morale of your staff. So, that can be another instance that you got to take in consideration as far as a cost. Lawsuits and legal fees. You make somebody sick, they're going to sue you for damages. So that's, definitely hits you in the pocketbook as well. Staff missing work. If it's a reason that when your staff gets sick, obviously you're going to have to take that into consideration as well. Increased insurance premiums. If you have a foodborne outbreak, your insurance is definitely going to be going up. So you've got, get a monetary hit coming there as well. And then, staff retraining. If it's something that's been linked to something that your staff has done, they're going to need to be retrained to make sure that doesn't happen again. Although, unfortunately, by that time, it could be too little too late because the business might not survive. How does foodborne illness occur? Well, there are 3 ways that foodborne illness can happen. And it's through biological, chemical or physical contamination. And those are important ones to know. They might be on some tests coming up, just saying. But biological, chemical, and physical contaminations are the three ways that food can be contaminated. Most of us, when we think sanitation, we think biological contaminants. We think, oh, a bacteria, a virus, a parasite, or a fungi. That's what we usually concentrate on. And that's all the things that you talk about when somebody's getting sick. It's usually something that's a biological based contaminant. So that's the most common, or the least the most visible, so to speak, as far as the contaminants are concerned. However, we also have an issue of potentially chemical contaminants. So chemical cleaners, sanitizers, polishes, getting in contact with the food. You can see there in the picture there, looks like there's a spray bottle of some sort of chemical, and it's just being sprayed right there next to that. Looks like maybe tomato sauce or pasta sauce or something along those lines. Not only is it adding some interesting flavor, so to speak, but again, that gets in your body, you get chemicals in your body, it can make you sick as well. So chemical contamination is another thing that we need to be conscientious about. And then physical contamination, things such as metal shavings, staples, bandages, glass, dirt, or natural objects, even fish bones and a fillet. That's probably one of the biggest ones. If you have an aversion to eating fish, there's a high probability you might have eaten a piece of fish that had a bone still in it, and you feel like you're almost going to choke to death, or at least it's definitely uncomfortable. But things, metal shavings, you want something that really makes me go, oh my gosh. Students that are cutting on the stainless steel tables in the kitchen, they have the butter out, and instead of pulling out a cutting board, they're like, oh, I'll just cut it right here on the table. No. You risk physical contamination. Metal shavings could potentially get into that butter that's being cut, which goes into the customer's mouth, and then they end up, with internal bleeding because these metal shards are going down through their esophagus and their stomach and into their small and large intestines. So, while biological contaminants are really, we're going to focus a lot of that, and Chapter 2 is all about biological contaminants, but we also have to remember that chemical and physical contaminants are also important, and we need to make sure we're safeguarding our customers against those as well. So, how does food become unsafe? So, there is probability that food is unsafe when it comes into us through things that are happening outside of our kitchen. But you're going to find that most of the time, if a food is unsafe, it's usually operator error. It's usually our fault when it comes to that. First and foremost, I kind of talked about a little bit ago, purchasing food from unsafe sources. So if you're getting sources that are not necessarily on the up and up, or instead you're getting them from your buddy that, went and killed their own, their deer, and you don't know about that animal or anything like that, unsafe sources can be a big one. However, the next two especially, and even number 5 are your big ones. First of all, failing to cook food correctly. We're going to talk, not in this chapter, but down the road, as far as temperatures that we need to cook our food to deem it safe, and what we need to hold our food at in order to maintain the safety of it, hot and cold. If you're not cooking it correctly or not holding it correctly, number 3, those are probably 2 of the biggest ones that we see as far as issues with food becoming unsafe. Contaminated equipment's another one. So we're not properly cleaning our equipment between use. So we're not sanitizing, making sure that any bacteria that might be on there is being eliminated. That's another one that can really hurt us. And then last but not least is the practicing poor personal hygiene. People that are not washing their hands at all, or they're not doing it correctly or at the times that they're supposed to. They're not properly covering when they're sneezing, things along those lines. That bad hygiene practices are the other one as far as foodborne illness risks that come into play when we are working in the industry. So there are four basic categories when it comes to things as far as food becoming unsafe. And that there is time temperature abuse, there's cross-contamination, poor personal hygiene, and poor cleaning and sanitizing. So we want to look at, okay, which going to be, if something's going to happen and the food's going to get contaminated, why is it happening? Okay. So if it's time temperature abuse is where food has stayed too long at temperatures that are good for pathogen growth. We're going to talk about later where we want to keep our food hot and cold. But if we are keeping food in that bad zone, we call the temperature danger zone. You'll learn that one a little bit later. But if you keep your food in that temperature danger zone and it stays there too long, you're just inviting bacteria and other pathogens to grow. So we need to make sure we keep it outside that zone and leave it there for the shortest amount of time possible. The other thing that we see too, not only the stored, but if it's not been cooked or reheated correctly, that's another one. Or if it's not cooled correctly, that's a big one that people forget. You know, it's great when you're cooling your, when you're cooking your product, but if you're going to cool it and then use it later, there are specific regulations for how you have to cool that food and what temperatures they need to reach at what times in order to minimize the risk of foodborne illness. Cross-contamination, that's another one. Cross-contamination is when bacteria or pathogens are transferred from one food surface to another, one surface to another. So you can see on this picture here, you got this lettuce. Looks like it has drops of red stuff. I'm going to assume it's some either blood or it's some sort of meat juice that has dripped on top of it. Well, those drops of that juice there could contain bacteria, and they were stored incorrectly because that should never be stored above lettuce. We'll get to that in another chapter. But because of that, that's a classic example of cross-contamination where the lettuce has become contaminated because the stuff that was potentially contaminated fell onto the non-contaminated stuff. So because of that, now the lettuce is now considered contaminated. If we add contaminated ingredients to something that received no further cooking, that can be considered cross-contamination. So like this lettuce, it's iceberg lettuce. Most of us don't cook our iceberg lettuce. So if we have introduced bacteria to that lettuce and then prep it and serve it with no further cooking, we've increased the risk of somebody getting sick because there is no cooking to potentially destroy any of the bad bacteria or what have you that might be there. If ready to eat foods touch contaminated surfaces. So that lettuce maybe goes onto a cutting board that's been contaminated and it's ready to eat. Well, now we're transferring that bacteria to our customer. Like you see in this example here, contaminated food touches or drips fluid onto cooked or ready to eat foods. If a food handler touches a contaminated food and then touches a ready to eat food without first changing gloves, washing hands in between, things like that, that can be an issue. You know, they touched raw beef, and then as soon as they touch that raw beef, they go and they handle the lettuce for that burger that's coming together. Well, you didn't wash your hands or you didn't change gloves or anything like that. You've transferred the bacteria that's probably on that ground beef, that raw ground beef, and now moved it over to the lettuce, which is not going to be cooked or anything, which now you've done a cross-contamination. Another one, of course, can be contaminated wiping cloths, touch food contact surfaces, that you're not doing your proper practice as far as your wiping cloths. And so instead of being a way to wash and sanitize, it's actually transmitting bacteria and you're transmitting it yourself. Again, we'll talk in other chapters as far as how we prevent that. Things that we do hopefully eventually will become second nature to help prevent those things from happening. But it is things we need to be aware of. And as a chef, the biggest thing, hopefully once you get to that level that you're running a kitchen, that most of these things are ingrained in your head, but you now have to be the the referee or the babysitter or whatever you want to call it, making sure your staff is not doing things that are going to make people sick. You know, it's one thing as a culinarian and you're watching out for yourself, making sure you're not making somebody sick. It's another thing when you're the chef or the kitchen manager, and not only are you making sure you're not doing it, but you also have to make sure everybody else is not doing it too. Part of the fun that comes from the management side of being a chef. Poor personal hygiene, failure to wash your hands correctly after using the restroom. How many times have we been in a restroom and we've seen somebody in with us, they went to the bathroom and they just walk right out the door? Ew. You know, it's something that it should be second nature to people to wash their hands after use the restroom, but we know in actuality, it's usually not that way. Somebody coughing or sneezing on the food, the droplets from that cough or sneeze getting onto the food. If you have something that's virus or bacteria related and it potentially in that, it's going into the food. Touching or scratching wounds and then touching food. Again, in your mind, you're probably going, ew, who would do that? But sometimes it happens. Again, hopefully we're training ourselves to making sure we're conscientious about where our hands are going, especially when we're working with food, but it doesn't always work that way. And probably one of the biggest ones, the biggest culprit I see, at least from this side, as far as poor personal hygiene, is working while sick. You know, and that's a tough one in our industry because it seems like our bosses tell us that we need you there no matter what. Well, if you're there when you're sick, you're potentially spreading those lovely germs to all of your coworkers and potentially all your customers too. As chefs, you know, the future generation of chefs I'm talking to here, if your employee is sick, send them home. It's better to be short-staffed than have a sick person there potentially making other people sick. Because if they are there and now they're making the rest of your line sick, guess what? You're going to be in even bigger problems down the road when now it's not just one person that's sick, but you got 3 people or 4 people sick. All right. But we see it more often than I'd care to think about as far as people working while they're actually sick. Last one within the 4, poor cleaning and sanitizing. You know, cross-contamination is, you know, the fact that, you know, we've transferred something from one surface to another. But poor cleaning and sanitation, I think we have the thought that we've done it right. But if you haven't done it right, now you've got this false sense of security going on. And you're actually still making people sick, even though you think you're not because you did it incorrectly. So poor cleaning and sanitizing, well, first off would be if you're not washing, rinsing, and sanitizing your equipment and utensils properly. If you're not doing, I mean, licking the spoon does not count as cleaning the spoon to use later. It needs to be washed, rinsed, and sanitized, right? Okay. If food contact surfaces are just wiped clean, how many times have we done that? Show of hands, being figurative here. You know, we probably do it all the time at home. You know, there's a mess on the kitchen counter. What do? We got the paper towels, we wipe it up, and then we walk away. Okay. We probably should wipe it up and then get out the sanitizer, you know, the Clorox wipes or whatever, and making sure that if there's any bacteria that was in that mess, that we're getting rid of that too. Same thing happens, especially in our commercial kitchens. If something gets spilled on the table, on your work table, yeah, you need to wipe it up, but you also need to make sure you're washing and sanitizing your table too, to make sure there's no leftover bacteria. Remember, that stuff you can't see. You can't physically see, especially those biological contaminants. So we need to assume that they're there and then use methods to get rid of them. If you don't store your wiping cloths in a sanitizer solution between uses, we'll talk more about that later, but it's imperative that if you're using a reusable towel for wiping down surfaces, that they're always stored in the solution to prevent bacteria from wanting to start growing. Okay? The other side to it too with sanitizing is if your sanitizing solutions are not the required levels, there are specific concentrations that are required for different sanitizers, which again, we'll talk about in a different chapter. But if they're not those required levels, if they're too low, they're not going to do their job. On the flip side though, you're like, oh, I'll go too high. If they're too high, you potentially now have a chemical contaminant going on. So yeah, it might kill biological contaminants, but then it's leaving residual chemicals, which can then make somebody sick that way. So there's a reason why there are specific levels or ranges that are considered safe for the chemicals that we might be using. Okay? So please make sure you're following them. All right. So what food is the most likely to become unsafe? There are two types, TCS and ready to eat are the two types that are most likely to become unsafe. So what is TCS? So TCS means time and temperature controlled for safety. That will be on all of your tests. Just FYI, if I ask what a TCS food is time and temperature controlled for safety. All right. So, probably edition 4 or 5, something like that. We're in edition 7 now. They used to call it potentially hazardous foods. All right. Potentially hazardous foods are now called TCS. So if you see us old school culinarians talk about potentially hazardous foods, this is what we're talking about. We mean TCS foods. TCS is the new lingo that we use. Originally, again, it was called potentially hazardous, at least when I started a couple of years ago. That's what it was called. But TCS foods is one of them. And so time and temperature control for safety means that there are certain foods that we need to be conscientious of the temperature it's at and the time that it's in the bad temperature area to make sure we prevent bacteria growth. So some examples of TCS foods, and of course, these are all in your book. That first upper left is milk and dairy products, shell eggs, unless they have been pasteurized, which you can buy pasteurized shell eggs, but basic shell eggs are TCS foods. Meat, so beef, pork, and lamb, all different types of meat are TCS. All types of poultry, so your chicken, duck, turkey, all those fun things. Fish and shellfish are all considered TCS foods. Baked potatoes, heat treated plant foods. So the cooked rice that's around the outside of that stir fry, it looks like, as well as the beans and the vegetables. So once you take a plant food and you heat treat it, then it becomes TCS. So rice in and of itself is not TCS. You store it in your pantry. It doesn't go in the refrigerator or anything like that. It doesn't hurt anything. Most vegetables are TCS foods. You know, you store your onions, you store carrots, things like that. You've ever been out farmer's market, you know, all that stuff is just sitting out. It's not necessarily in a refrigerator. It doesn't need to be while it's in its raw state. However, as soon as you cook it, as soon as you apply heat to it, so you boil the rice to cook it, you saute or stir fry the vegetables, now those products are TCS foods. Okay. Tofu or other soy products are considered TCS foods as well. Or if there's anything that has a soy base to it, so what they call texture soy protein, so your meat alternatives or meat extenders, all of those are TCS foods. Sprouts and sprout seeds, anything that is a sprout, alfalfa, bean, things along those lines, any seeds from that are considered TCS because the condition that they grow and the fact that we really can't wash them or anything makes them a little bit more dangerous for people. Here are some of the new ones that throws people off. Sliced melon. So that cantaloupe, when it's whole, can be at room temperature, not a problem. As soon as it gets sliced, though, it now becomes a TCS food. Tomatoes, the same thing. You know, they say you should store your tomatoes out at room temperature, right? As soon as you slice that tomato or you dice that tomato, nope, it is considered a TCS food. It has to be refrigerated. Cut greens are the same thing. So you got some romaine lettuce growing in your garden at home, or you've harvested from your garden at home, if it's still whole, you're okay. As soon as you get that bad boy cut, it needs to be refrigerated. Any untreated garlic and oil mixtures. So anytime you are making a house-made flavored oil, that is considered a TCS food because it does contain conditions for bacteria to grow. Okay? So there's a decent amount you can see as far as items that are considered TCS foods. Again, these are all in your book. And we need to be conscientious about that because we need to identify which ones need to be refrigerated to be stored and which ones can we leave at room temperature for storage. And remember, there are those variations like the rice, for example. So the other side is ready to eat food. Anything that's considered ready to eat, we have to be careful of because there is very little to no preparation that needs to be done, especially no cooking, all right, or further cooking. So if it's a ready to eat food, you don't have to prep it, wash it, or cook it. So examples of ready to eat foods include any cooked food. So once you've cooked something, it's ready to eat. So now it automatically becomes TCS. Okay. Once you've washed a fruit or vegetable, whole or cut, they are considered ready to eat foods. So that apple, I could have at room temperature. Once it's washed, then it's considered a ready to eat food. So I do need to be careful with how I am taking care of that because of potential cross-contamination is being the biggest one. Deli meats are definitely ready to eat food. So sliced turkey, ham, things like that for sandwiches. Bakery items are ready to eat. Now, again, with these examples, they're ready to eat, but they're not necessarily time and temperature controlled for safety. All right. But because we're going to use them without further heat treatment or anything like that, we need to make sure we are handling them correctly so that we don't transfer bacteria to make somebody sick. So bakery items is ready to eat food, and most of your sugars, spices, and seasonings also qualify as ready to eat food. Not that you're just going to sit down to a bowl of turmeric or something like that, but you're going to put that turmeric in, and usually it's something that it's finishing up. So there's very little, if any, heat applied, or technically it can be used on its own. Somebody's going to put in a smoothie, something along those lines. So we do have to be conscientious about those foods as well. So another thing that we need to be thinking about is, are we serving people that are considered high risk for foodborne illness? So there are 3 categories or groups of people that are considered high risk, right? And these are preschool age children, the elderly, and people with compromised immune systems. Right? Because of many different reasons, but usually because of their immune system or their growth or where they're at. That's usually why, school age children, they usually don't have a built up immune system because they're too younger. Elderly people, it usually happens because their immune systems are not doing as well. And of course, if you have compromised immune systems because you're in the hospital or you have a medical condition that affects your immune system, those groups of people, we need to make sure we're being even more careful when it comes to working with them. So if you're working in a daycare, you're working in a retirement home, you're working in a hospital, the protocols are probably going to be even more stringent because people have higher probability there. Okay. So how do we keep food safe? So anytime that your restaurant or your place of business is open, you must have a person in charge, PIC, if you want to do an acronym. Okay. The person in charge must be a certified food protection manager. So that means that they have to have the advanced license as far as sanitation, not just the food handler license. By taking this class with me, doing the course book, and at the end of the time, when you are doing the ServSafe exam, you will be taking the food protection manager's exam, okay, which is more in depth than just the food handler exam. So that certificate allows you to be a PIC for an establishment, right? The law requires that you need to have at least one PIC or food protection manager anytime the restaurant or the business is open. So you're working in the restaurant, you're the certified food protection manager. Anytime that restaurant is open, either you or somebody else that has that designation has to be there. You cannot have the business open and not have a certified food protection manager. If you do and you get caught, there are consequences as far as fines, being shut down, all that fun stuff. So that's why it's really important that you take this class seriously. You get that food protection manager license. So then you're out in the industry, you have that credential to help you. You're more valuable when you think about it, because restaurants need certified food protection managers for any time that they are open, or they run the risk of getting shut down and fined. So that's why it's really, really important. In this class, we train you to take that exam so you can get that food protection manager certification. Okay. The only time that a person in charge does not need to be on site at all times is if the operation is a minimal risk. Okay. And that's based upon the type of operation and the type of food being served. So for example, you go into a convenience store or a cashierless market, you don't need a food protection manager that's there. Right? Because there's minimal stuff going on. If you're selling predominantly prepackaged items that are prepared off-site, then you do not need that food protection manager certification, somebody there with that as far as a person in charge. But if you're in any traditional type of or semi-traditional type of restaurant, bakery, catering, any type of dining establishment type of thing, you do have to have that person in charge that's there. So to become that certified food protection manager, you have to pass a test from an accredited program and be accredited by the agency approved by a conference for food protection. By completing this course and passing the ServSafe exam at the end of our 8 weeks together, that allows you to meet this requirement. So the book that we have, the ServSafe course book, the test that you'll take, the ServSafe test that you'll take 2 tests in this class. You'll take a final exam and then you'll take the ServSafe exam. The final exam is what you get graded on. The ServSafe exam is not included in your grade score, but you do need it in order to move on to CA 150, because we have to have anyone that's cooking food needs to have a sanitation license. We just talked about this, right? So we need to make sure you have that taken care of. So when you're in, if a sanitarian comes in to do an inspection and they ask for our books, we can show them that, yes, Charles has his sanitation license and it expires in 2024. So I'm still good, type of thing. So why is it important to have that that certified food protection manager? So the Centers for Disease Control, they did a study and it showed that having a certified food protection manager on staff anytime the restaurant is open would help to reduce the risk of foodborne illness, because you have somebody, at least one person there that is trained in advanced sanitation practices to be looking out for those potential pitfalls that could make somebody sick. It was a distinguishing factor between restaurants that experienced an outbreak and those that did not. When they looked at the data, restaurants that experienced outbreaks more often than not did not have a certified food protection manager. And again, it's why Illinois requires that. And again, a step further, requires anybody that handles food to have at least that basic food handler's license. Okay. So studies suggest that because of the more advanced training, that it reduces the risk of foodborne illness and foodborne illness outbreaks at your establishments, which To me, it sounds like a good thing, right? Last thing we want to do is create things that are going to make our customers sick and us lose customers and lose revenue. So the basic practices, walking away from this chapter, some things we want to make sure that we're doing. We want to make sure we're purchasing from approved reputable suppliers. We want to control time and temperature, which we'll talk about in future chapters. We want to help prevent cross-contamination, which we'll also talk about later. Make sure we're practicing personal hygiene. Again, another thing we'll discuss. And then making sure we're correctly cleaning and sanitizing. And all of these we will go into more in depth in future chapters. So, food safety responsibilities of the manager. The FDA recommends these different responsibilities, that food handlers are regularly monitoring food temperatures during hot and cold holding. So it's not just looking, but it's actually pulling out the thermometer and making sure that things are being held at the correct temperatures, hot or cold. We want to ensure that food is not prepared in a private home where people are living or sleeping. If they're coming out of a commercial kitchen, that's fine. But most places, you're not allowed to do home baked stuff or home cooked stuff because it's coming out of a personal home, which means they're not inspected. We don't know necessarily the conditions of that kitchen or the level of sanitation experience that person may have. So we want to make sure that when we're serving things out of our restaurant, that they are coming from licensed kitchens and establishments, not coming from somebody's personal home. We want to restrict people that are in the prep, storage, and dishwashing areas other than food handlers. It's something that we don't want the general public in there as a general rule of thumb. We don't want anybody and everybody because they don't necessarily have the same sanitation practices that we do. And we want to, again, minimize the risk of our customers getting sick. We want to ensure that maintenance and delivery workers follow food safety practices. So even if they're not directly in the kitchen, the maintenance workers that are keeping our equipment up and our vendors and stuff, that they are following food safety practices as well, because they are potentially coming in contact with the same food that we are. Of course, we want to make sure we're monitoring staff hand washing. Again, I know it sounds like, oh my God, I gotta be a babysitter. Yeah, again, that's part of the glamorous life of being a chef. Sometimes it means you have to babysit. I like seeing observing or trust but verify type of thing, but it is something that we need to do as part of being that manager that's in charge, especially when it comes to sanitation coming in. We want to make sure our deliveries are being monitored to ensure that they're safe, that they're coming in from that approved source, correct temperatures, protected from contamination, and then they're accurately presented, which again, we'll talk about in a different chapter. Want to make sure our TCS foods are cooked and cooled correctly. They're cooked to the required temperatures to make sure they're safe. They're checked with calibrated thermometers, and then that they're cooled appropriately to make sure that they get through that temperature danger zone quick enough so they do not make people sick when we reheat. We want to make sure guests are properly notified. It is our responsibility for those consumer advisories for raw or partially cooked foods. You see that in menus all the time. Again, we'll talk about that in another chapter. Making sure our tableware is clean, especially in those self-service areas, just to make sure, again, we're not introducing potential areas where our guests can get sick. We've got to monitor staff and make sure training on food safety practices happen. How do we properly clean and sanitize? How do we handle ready to eat foods? Making sure we're aware of allergens within our customers. We have a chapter that includes allergen training. Plus, you also have that separate allergen training that is required as well, because the state of Illinois requires allergen training for all food handlers too, which is why we have it in here for you to take. So you again have that under your belt as well, not only for our kitchen here at ICC, but when you go out in the industry too. We also need to make sure that we have practices in place on reporting illnesses and symptoms if they should occur. Food safety procedures should be written down. They should be implemented and they should be maintained. And guess what? As the person in charge at PIC, that is your responsibility. Okay. Again, not the glamorous thing to talk about. This class is not the fun stuff, so to speak, but it's extremely important because, again, it doesn't matter how good your food looks or how good it tastes. If it makes somebody sick, it's not going to be good for you or for your establishment. Okay. Displaying your commitment to food safety. Of course, we want to make sure that we're training our staff and that training is being offered, and make sure you're updating it as needed. Make sure you're discussing food safety expectations ahead of time. Document and maintain food handling procedures. We'll talk about all that fun stuff later down the road. Consider awards and rewards for good food safety records. You know, you get a lot more from your employees with the carrot as opposed to the stick, you know, or you get more bees with flies with honey than you do vinegar, you know, whatever analogy we want to use. If you have a goal that your employees can work towards and they get rewarded for making that goal, you know, it's amazing sometimes how motivated our employees can be when they have something to be motivated towards. And of course, you know, anything, everything, make sure you set a good example. Make sure you are doing exactly what you expect your employees to do, because how should they expect them to have to do it when you're not doing it yourself? Okay, so you need to make sure you're always leading by example. And that's just the chef mantra as it is, lead by example. Chapter 1, as I said, is just that overview of why it's important for us to make sure we are providing safe food. And we're going to get into those details in those future chapters, but it's definitely an important thing. And as I said, I know it's not necessarily the most exciting topic that you will ever have within culinary arts, but it's something that if this doesn't happen, nothing else matters. So please take that in consideration. Study, utilize the apply your knowledge and chapter summaries in there. Use the study questions to help prepare you for not only my tests, but also the ServSafe test. And of course, I'm here to assist and be your guide during this 8 weeks when it comes to sanitation to get you ready to get you in the kitchen. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is chapter 1.